Good. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for June the 12th. I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held in the traditional territory of the Fort Nelson First Nation. Please be advised that tonight's meeting is available for public to attend virtually and is being streamed and recorded. Are there any additions to the Committee of the Whole meeting? Council? Staff? Seeing none, is there anybody from the public who would like to comment on something? No? Okay. Everybody's okay with what's on the agenda? Just going to do one thing on the agenda today. Good. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome James Morgan. He's a fisheries biologist with the Ministry of Forests. I think we met once before where you did a presentation at the Williston Advisory Committee, and I was on it. Maybe you were just online doing yeah. But anyways, welcome. I know there is some confusion. There's been a few letters going back and forth, and I guess this is an opportunity to I guess set the record straight or have a discussion with respect to the stocking of fish, and maybe potentially talk a little bit about Beaver Lake and the burrow pits along the Alaska Highway. So, do you have a presentation for us, or? Awesome. Oh yeah, sorry, I should have given you the directions.
Yes, alien technology to me. I hope I don't break it. That's all I have.
Yeah, it's pretty sensitive, so if you got it there, it'll pick up.
Okay, good. Yeah, I am a loud talker. I do talk really fast, so if I'm off to the races, just let me know. So my name is James Morgan. I've been in Fort St. John for 2 years and a bit now, actually, which is crazy to think about. I've been in the fisheries career for almost 10 years now. I've worked a lot in Northern Alberta, kind of transferred over here 2 years ago after doing a bunch of temporary salary positions in Alberta. And I love it here. I bought a place in Fort St. John last year. So hopefully I'll be here to stay because we've had a revolving door of fisheries biologists over the last probably 10 years or so. And so hopefully I can kind of keep in seat for a while here. I'll ask that questions kind of go to the end. There's probably some pressing ones, and I think I'll answer most of them right off the bat, or each slide will cover some of them. I touch on some of the questions that were asked in the letters as well, so we can go over those too. But the idea, next slide, please, thank you, is I'll kind of just go over how stocking works in British Columbia, because it can be somewhat of a black hole the more you dig into it, and the more genetics and strains and species that you actually look at, the deeper the hole actually gets. And it's somewhat can be confusing to me as well. I'll kind of give a timeline of the burrow pit stocking history. My recommendation, which is to put stocking back online for 3 of the burrow pits. So if that censors some questions right now, that's awesome. Yeah, there we go. I figured I'd answer that one slide too. So then people maybe lay back in their chair a little and go, okay, here we go. And then I'll kind of also talk about what else I'm doing. In the past, I don't think I have been doing a really good job about putting my name out there and showing what fisheries does in the region. And I'd like to highlight some of the cool stuff that we have been doing and then what we're actually up to. So next slide, please. So stocking doesn't actually happen by the province. It happens from the Freshwater Fisheries Society of BC. And so just like how hunting license dollars go back into a funding pot that we can use for inventories, the freshwater fisheries license dollars go back into funding pots for us. And so the Freshwater Fisheries Society, which I'm just going to call FFSBC, and I always shorten it to FSSBC because there's too many letters in there. They've been doing the stocking since 2003. They hold the provincial stocking license for any of the stocked lakes in the province until 2030, I believe, as well. And it was operated by the province since 1937. And so the relationship that we have with the Freshwater Fisheries Society is that we make recommendations based on what we're seeing, what our inventories say, and then they adjust. Now, that relationship can get somewhat tricky when they have shortages, disease, die-offs, and other political pressures elsewhere in the province. And so it's somewhat of a juggling act between regional biologists and the society in terms of where fish are allocated, what's allocated, and making up for lost time. So for instance, I'm currently dealing with stocking schedules in the fires down in Tumbler Ridge because there's currently a bunch in and around Boot Lake, One Island, and I have fish to stock in there. So there's a little juggling that goes around. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a layout of where the hatcheries are. Probably the biggest thing you can see is there's nothing north of Prince George. So clearly there's an issue there. There used to be a hatchery by the Dinosaur Reservoir in Fort St. John that was run, I believe, by BC Hydro as the compensation program. And that was deactivated, I think, in the 90s. I may have my years a little bit wrong there. But the two that I want you to pay attention to is the Vancouver Island hatchery and the Abbotsford hatchery. So those are starred red because they produce catchables. And now you're probably asking yourself, well, what's catchable? I don't understand, because every fish should be catchable once it goes in the water and I throw a hook at it. The catchable fish is usually held and grown for a period of about 12 months. And they get to be about half a pound or 250 grams when they're actually released. The idea is that they can go into water bodies that either winter kill or are heavily fished in and around urban areas. And one of the points that I'm going to make in this presentation is the Freshwater Fisheries Society is moving away from the winter kill catchables as the main source. And so that's kind of where we had some friction on the Boro Pit stuff. The Kootenay hatchery is white sturgeon, kokanee, and some trout, but already half of those are allocated to just Kootenay lakes. Clearwater is just going to be kokanee for the most part. One of the big ones that we're going to pay attention to during the presentation is the Prince George Distribution Center. So they do more of the commonly stocked rainbow trout and eastern brook trout strains. And then Abbotsford, Vancouver Island, spring catchables only in Abbotsford. And Vancouver Island's got cutthroat and steelhead as well. And then there's the Nechako white sturgeon recovery hatchery. So if we're only talking about catchables, there's the two farthest away hatcheries that we can pull from. If we're talking general rainbow trout, we can pull from Prince George, which is a lot closer. Next slide, please. So spring catchables, so these are pulled from Quality Lake. These fish, the issue, we're having a similar issue with Quality Lake because it's not winter killing anymore. And so Freshwater Society is interested in pulling and transferring over to Pennask rainbow trout, which is just a genetic strain of rainbow trout from where they come from, into that lake to ease the pressure on catchables and where they're going. They're a big play for catchables right now is if a lake winter kills and it's facing high pressure, they're going to throw catchables in because right away they are potentially able to be harvested. It's not a wait 2-3 years for these fish to grow big and actually catch them, and you're not sitting at a pond trying to fish with your kids and there's only rainbow trout this big and you're kind of sitting there twiddling your thumbs. The kind of big one that happened for the Boro Pits is FFSBC takes about 5 days based on the Ministry of Transportation guidelines, driving and scheduling to come up from those two hatcheries and back from Fort Nelson. One of the other ones that we've been juggling with is the spring catchables in 2022 tested positive for viral hemorrhagic septicemia. Super long word, we call it VHS, like the old tapes, and couldn't be stocked in the Peace watershed. And so to make this ever more complicated, because they're coming from so far away, they require a federal authorization to be stocked in a different watershed. If they pick up some sort of disease or virus or parasite from the hatchery, they're legally not allowed to enter the Peace. And so sometimes we get emails or calls from the hatchery saying your stock of catchables cannot be delivered. It has to stay within region in these closed off systems where they accept the risk. Ultimately, I could accept the risk, but professionally, that's something I would never do for VHS or anything like that because the potential risk of that spreading to native water bodies is pretty high. So another one that we just had was the spring catchables in the hatchery system have to be stocked by next week because they are cleaning the tanks for an upgrade. So we face multiple kind of interesting timelines on that schedule. We could do next slide, please. So I'm sure some of you have seen this, but this is the Go Fish or the Freshwater Fisheries Society stocking summary for 2021. So you'll see Boro Pit 1, 4, and 8 were stocked with about 665 spring catchables. Those were coming out of Fraser Valley. And quality gets about 1,500. And I just wanted to note that those are going to be Pennask yearlings. So one of the questions that council had asked was there were fish that were going to other northern regions like Inga Lake and Wanawan, Tumbler Ridge, and those sorts of things, or regions, I guess. And so lots of these are coming from the Prince George Trout Distribution Center. So like Aylmer strain, Pennask, Blackwater strain are all going to be coming out of the Prince George Fire, or not Fire Center, that's on my mind clearly, the Prince George Distribution Center. And so that's where I think in my recommendation you'll see is where I'd like to actually switch sourcing the fish from. They only come from 4 hours away. Instead of a 5-day trip round, it's about a 2-day trip round. So we solve that kind of logistical problem there. You'll also see that there's a few in the life stage category there. We've got fingerlings, yearlings, and spring catchables. Spring catchables are those larger fish that we talked about. Yearlings are still going to be, I think they're growing for about 12 months, obviously, because they're a yearling, but they don't grow to the same size, but they can still be harvested immediately the next year. And so we're looking at about a 1-year kind of drawback in terms of them being harvested, but then we can start stacking. And so we may have multiple size classes that can lead to what I would call and what many would call a family fishery. You can have kids catching smaller fish, having a great time. Dad can go out there and maybe catch one monster in 5 years and be super happy. And you kind of have a diverse size class structures is what we call. Next slide, please. So we talked about costs. This was a question that came in from council. So additional water bodies in the Northeast that were stocked. So all lakes in the Northeast are captured in that Freshwater Fisheries Society summary report. There's nothing that's stocked from outside. The only ones that you wouldn't see are private rainbow trout ponds. So on people's properties, those get sourced from Tom's Trouts for the most part. And then, as I discussed before, Inga Lake and Moose Lake were the kind of the examples that were in this question are coming from the Prince George Distribution Center. So those were not the same as the fish being destined for the Boro pits. They weren't catchables. Quality was stocked with catch. Correct. Yeah. There's about 8 moose lakes in the provinces, and it so much confusion. There's also multiple swan lakes, which leads to multiple questions. So kind of the cost prohibitive factors that go into stocking is the right product for the right water body. And ultimately this is what's coming down for the Boro pits is a catchable fish that potentially has the potential in a water body to winter kill the right product, or can we switch that to something that may still be effective for the anglers that are being present? The other one is going to be effective management of effort and catch. So if we stock a lake with 2,000 fish, let's say, is that going to stunt the growth? So then there's, only tiny rainbow trout. People aren't that excited because they're really only catching small fish that they don't want to fillet. They don't want to put the effort in, and they're just going out there for the time and then leaving. That's something that we also have to mention. And then the HAS decision making. So this is the hatchery allocation committee that's run by Freshwater Fisheries Society. So bringing the Boro pits back online, that comes down to me making a proposal and stating the case for the Boro pits and why I think the strain, the numbers, the timing is important and effective for those water bodies. Next slide. And so oh no. Okay, so apparently it didn't go past 2009, but I will say it myself. So 2006, this is a breakdown of the Boro pits and their stocking along with Beaver Lake. So this was getting somewhat confusing in our letters back and forth. And so I'd like to just set the record straight in terms of timing. So 2006 was the last year of the spring catchable stocking in Boro pits 6, 7, and 9. And that was the last time that those 3 were stocked. In 2009, Boro pit 2 was taken offline. In 2010, Boro pits 1 and 4 were stocked with yearling rainbow trout. So those are going to be smaller than the catchables. And then Boro pit 8 got stocked with spring catchables. In 2012, Beaver Lake was brought back online with spring catchables. 2015, Boro pits 1 and 4 switched over to spring catchables. So now we've got Boro pits 1, 4, and 8 all being stocked with the larger rainbow trout. In 2018, that was the last spring catchable stocking for Borrow Pit 2, and the last year for Beaver Lake as well. So Beaver Lake went offline in 2018, and Borrow Pit 2 was stocked in 2018. So effectively there's 4, or 3, sorry. And then 2021 was the last year stocking for 1, 4, and 8. Ultimately, that was my decision. And also those lakes wouldn't have been stocked anyway because the catchables were caught with viral hemorrhagic septicemia. Next slide. And I can send an updated presentation that has this timeline too. So there was some questions about the decision for the, to terminate stocking and when will it be revisited. In my presentation, I have a big now. So we'll be revisiting it now. So the proposal that I have is, so Borrow Pits 1 and 4, I'm proposing stocking of yearling all-female triploid rainbow trout. So all-female triploid essentially means that they don't reproduce. Regular fish in the wild are diploid. Triploid means they have 3. The idea is that they put more energy into growth instead of maturation. So effectively, we have fish that can grow bigger faster, but they don't reproduce. Something that we've learned in our stocking throughout the region and the province is that if you start overstocking diploids, but there's a lack of spawning habitat, which the Borrow Pits have, there's not any running water, there's no nice gravel for them to spawn over with aerated water coming in. They tend to get atretic eggs and those reabsorb, and that takes energy. And so if you're catching fish in the spring, you're actually seeing fish that are thin, having tissue decline in terms of quality, and people don't like that for eating. Borrow Pit 8, there's the data that I have on file shows that there's a potential regular winter kill there. So I'm proposing a fingerling stocking for rainbow trout. And then some winter dissolved oxygen monitoring to see how they're doing. The idea with Borrow Pit 8 is that it goes down to about, I think, 8 meters there. So there should be habitat, but for some reason, due to vegetation or lack of wind or multiple environmental factors, doesn't seem to keep fish alive that very well, or that well. Poor English there. And so effectively, if we stock them with fingerlings, and this may change because the hatchery may say, well, we don't want to bring 1 truck up with yearlings and 1 truck up with fingerlings. We'll just stock it with yearlings. My thought process there was Borrow Pit 8 is the closest one to town. People don't want to drive all the way out to Borrow Pit 1. It's right there. They can fish. And it has fairly targetable habitat off the access points. And we'll monitor these essentially after 4 years. And so one of the things that you can shoot yourself in the foot in biology is you make a change and you look for the change immediately. That really doesn't work. Biology needs time to happen. Things need time to grow. Fish need time to grow and be harvested and see how that density works out. And so effectively, if these were proposed for the 2024 fishing season, in 2028, we'd come back up and take a look at what the density looks like. And assess what that is, and then change any of the stocking protocols, kind of what we see. One of the interesting things that I may propose, this isn't definitive at all, but there is an option, and the hatchery is potentially looking at potentially new species. So one of those new species is tiger trout. What we've been seeing from the Alberta side of things in terms of pressure is that BC residents are going to Moonshine Lake to fish for tiger trout because they're a fairly rare species, all things considered, across Canada. They're a hybrid. And so that may be something to draw people to the Borrow Pits. And that may be something to kind of attract different anglers, different angler types, or attract people just for new fishing opportunities as well. So proposal would go in. This is just speaking to the proposed 2024 fishing season. I'd be putting in the proposal within the next few months to the Freshwater Fisheries Society to go to HASP, which is the Hatchery Allocation Stocking Prescriptive Committee. I forgot the SP. And then that would go forward to be stocked in 2024. Next slide, please. Big knock noise. Just listening to that. So when we talk about the effort that was on the Borrow Pits, this was a question that came up in council from the 2018 creel that we did. So So yes, so 299, 272 for those two pits for the context of Fort Nelson is high. And I think one of the things to consider is the scope. And so for the Fort Nelson area, that's high. That's about 114 anglers per hectare. What we don't have for that is how long those anglers were actually fishing. And some of the failures, or I guess failures is a poor word, some of the weaknesses of that survey is we assume anybody at those borrow pits is fishing. There are or is evidence of some people not. They're either kayaking, camping, stretching their legs, those sorts of things. And so it's just easier to put a sweeping assumption on that and say, yeah, all 299 for borrow pit 1 were angry. And so one of the points was that could have been higher. And yeah, I agree, that could have been higher. It also could have been low. And so we have kind of an area of variance that we like to say of what the effort looked like. When we look at the borrow pits in comparison to the northeast region, effort is lower. And in terms of BC, effort's very low. And so that's how kind of the scope of study works. We don't do a ton of creel surveys. The 2018 camera creel was a 3-year project that ended in 2021 when I first started. And it had been running on 3 or 4 lakes. And the borrow pits were some of the only lakes that were actually analyzed. We've done a full creel on Williston Reservoir, very poor comparison, but we're looking at 17,600 hours fished on Williston. Obviously, you cannot compare, 117,000 hectare lake to a 2 hectare lake. That's a very poor comparison. I would agree with you that, yeah, the borrow pits are fished well. I think Mayor Fraser made the point of it does provide an opportunity for people that don't want to drive far for an easy access lake. Don't disagree. I think that's a very good point. That's what factored into our decision, or my decision, for reactivating. And so if we go to the next slide. So in my spare time of being allocated to all these projects, I do a lot of other stuff. So if you're unaware, so I'm the only fish bio for the whole Northeast, and the whole Northeast is a very large area of the province. It's about 22%. And most parts of the province have a small lakes fish biologist, which is mainly just focusing on stocked lakes, a rivers biologist, and then a large lakes bio. I'm lucky enough that I do all 3, which kind of puts me in this jack of all trades, master of none kind of scenario that I like to think about. But we've had a very busy few years, and I think that's been a general shift in the thought process of fish in the Northeast for a long time. And I think a lot of people do agree, including myself. Wildlife management in the Northeast has been number 1, and fish has always been number 2. I don't see that changing, but it's almost like we're going to 1.9, and I'm very happy with that. And so for August of 2023, we'll be doing a full lake trout population assessment on Muncho Lake and Summit Lake. So that data hasn't been done since 2008. The Moberly Lake Trout population study in telemetry is pretty unique for British Columbia. It was a giant stocking effort between 2012, 2016. And lake trouts are very long-lived and slow growing. For instance, like the oldest lake trout in Muncho Lake that we've seen was 43, which is 11 years older than myself, which is wild to think about. And so we did conservation stocking in Moberly Lake starting in 2012, and we're just starting to see those stocked fish come online or get recruited to spawning shoals. And so there's definitely a lot of regional, provincial, national interest in that lake. And so that's quite a fun project, stressful project as well. Stream habitat and fish passage surveys. So for instance, last September, I was up on Nanda for a week, taking a look at that system, and assessing it for fish passage and what fish were present in the washout area. Another big one's going to be our bull trout red surveys. A red is essentially a concave piece in the stream bed where bull trout females will excavate some rock, lay their eggs, males will come over, spawn over top, and they'll cover it up. And for the province of British Columbia, that's our best scenario in terms of calculating bull trout density. So we do pool, or I guess we've just started getting annual support for the reaches in the Muskwa, which is really exciting since it's a fairly backcountry access point in comparison to the ones that we have in the South Piece. And from the looks of things, the bull trout and the muskwa are doing great. I get lots of questions about jet boats on the Chody and if that has a negative impact on bull trout running up to their tributaries and such. And so that's a nice one to tie in. We're working on the Pine River for bull trout telemetry, just looking at some wildlife habitat areas. So those are legal designations that have habitat protections on them. It's one of my only levers that I can pull in terms of habitat protection for fish. It also happens for ungulates as well. For the small lake surveys, so we're looking at more around Fort St. John, but obviously Summit Lake would factor into that because it's under 100 hectares. One of the big ones that I've been noticing, and probably some of you, is our signage throughout the region is pretty lacking. I come from Alberta and Ontario, where signage is essentially at most access points or each boat launch, and essentially lays everything out in terms of regulation changes, things to know about the lake. And so that's been a pet project of mine to get public awareness back up in terms of fishing regulations, bull trout versus lake trout, Dolly Varden versus bull trout, naming nomenclatures, those sorts of things, which is quite exciting and nice to see. And then a FWIN survey, which is a fancy acronym for a walleye survey, is hopefully scheduled for Max Hamish in 2024. There's been some local interest in Max Hamish and its walleye health. And so that's something to take a look at as well. And Swan Lake as well, since one of those regulations is fairly old. Or the only regulation. That's my contact info. I tell people all the time, you can contact me. For the most part, you'll probably leave a voicemail, but I call everybody back. It may be a week or two later, but I don't hide. The interesting thing coming from Alberta is I don't think biologist numbers are listed anymore. So it's kind of cool being in a state of, if somebody Googles James Morgan Fisheries biologist, my work number comes up right away. And I'm happy to talk anything if you have concerns, questions, looking for maps, historical data, I'm happy to talk to that. So if there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them right now.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to hear that you are going to continue stocking those. I'll hold my question, and maybe somebody else will ask it, but I'll give everybody an opportunity. Ask him. Councilor next.
And I'm very excited that you're going to continue on. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Learned a few things that I didn't know.
Perfect.
So yeah, thank you again.
No problem.
Anybody else?
If we were to find, there's quite a number of other borrow pits around this area. If we were to find other borrow pits that could be stocked, and either, I know some of them on private land, some of them on forestry roads and so on. If we were to form a society here in Fort Nelson, say, hey, borrow pit society, fishing society, we call it something, would we be able to create, would that benefit, would that create synergy with the highway stocking program that you're part of, simply because the quantities would be there? I just say that from a point of view of how there's some of our off-road access, there's a couple of borrow pits that get used probably as much in the summer as our swimming pool does, things like that along some of the roads. And I think that there's some really significant borrow pits, and I think that maybe we could do something to enhance this rather than just barely keep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So one of the first things that we look at when we are potentially going to stock a water body is connectivity, right? So borrow pits have to be fully isolated from any sort of natural water body. One of the things we've looked at for Doohoo Lake, for instance, by Bucking Horse River there, fully a grayling lake. They came up from the upper Beaton. It was stocked with rainbow trout, completely outcompeted. It's now its own unique ecosystem, which is actually very awesome. But if that was anything else, potentially negative. And so, yeah, I think that is an option. The biggest, I guess, issue that we have with stocking is dissolved oxygen, right? And so part of the issue with aerating is if there isn't enough oxygen, and disturbing the column with the aerator helps a little, but it may only open up a meter for fish to live. And that's, they're stressed out 90% of the time and only living in a meter. And if we do have a cold year, we do limit that habitat. I'm not opposed to it for sure. I do think it's a good idea if you can say, hey, freshwater fisheries, actually, instead of the 2,000 that we wanted, we actually want 10. And that would be something that we could look at for sure. I'd be open to comments.
Good. Please, Councilor Going.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. You said that you're going to propose X, Y, and Z for 2024 season. When will you know whether that's going to, because you're making a proposal, but not necessarily the decision. So when will the decision be made, and would you inform us?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd inform you. Timeline wise, probably winter of next year, realistically. That's when allocation usually is at least somewhat informed, and we get approvals in terms of our stocking lists. So yeah, winter of 2024 is probably a pretty good.
So then winter of 2024 would mean it wouldn't be, if approved, it wouldn't get stocked until.
No, it gets stocked in 2024.
Okay.
So what happens is they do egg takes in the spring. So freshwater fisheries gets their eggs, and they'll start doing looking at quantities, and then I'll have my proposal in now or the next 2 months. And then they'll approve it in the winter, but then it won't get stocked until the spring of 2024. Yeah, there's always a surplus. So they're always allocating 1 for natural mortality and 2 for stocking mortality. And for the most part, these are fairly low asks in terms of fish density. Like 1,000 fish to them is a drop in the bucket. And so it would be fairly accurate to say that 2024 for the spring stocking event would be, doable.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. So just to follow up. So if I'm remembering correctly, one of the reasons cited for not continuing to stock was the person power required to actually do the stocking, being that we're so far from.
The Highland. Sounds
Thank
like.
you.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Well, wherever.
Yeah.
So I mean, you made the proposal that it come out of Prince George, which makes total sense, but is then the person power going to be available to actually do the stocking, or?
So I won't speak for Freshwater Society because I can't. But logistically, it cuts down on 3 days of travel, and they're looking at scheduling conflicts for the manpower they need to stock, and those 2 drivers in 1 truck getting pulled off of additional lakes getting stocked for the boral pits. And so if we can slim that down to 2 days out of Prince George, they'll also most likely, and this is a hypothetical as just a regional biologist, most likely swing through Fort St. John, do a bunch of stocking there, then head up the highway to the boral pits, overnight Fort St. John, and then back to Prince George, is my guess. I mean, I'm speaking very much as this looks good on a map, accuracy here. But once they're in a truck, they basically get allocated via net or the nice chute hose that they have, right? And so, yeah, if we can make it one larger trip for a majority of the region, that would be good. And obviously, like, I can talk to the hatchery manager, just, I hate using this word, synergize the stocking of certain species so it makes more sense. Like I talked about the brook trout aspect, but if that's going to throw another truck into the mix and potentially not work, or if they can do that on a different season, that may be the move. But if it's on 1 truck, it doesn't make much sense.
I can follow
Yeah,
through.
sure.
Okay, so would it be worth our efforts to do any advocacy work directly with FWS?
Oh, FSBC.
Yeah.
So Craig, the hatchery manager, is aware. So I was chatting with him before this meeting to iron out some of the proposal details and getting kind of a loose agreement, I guess, per se. So he's aware. I can ask him and see if that's something that would work well in our benefit. I think potentially it would at this state in the game. But yeah, I can make that an action item to follow up with Craig.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? I also wanted to thank you for the presentation, James.
Yeah, no problem.
It was good. It kind of gave us a good idea what's happening. So I had a question about enhancement, but you already answered that. But I had a question about the VHS and the fish that have that. They will stock them within their own regions, but they won't stock them outside. But it seems to me these are borrow pits. These are like if these fish are diseased, they're not going anywhere. Like it's a disease that they will turn the fish loose with, right? So, you said professionally, you wouldn't want to bring them up here because of potential to get out into the rest of the region. But if they're going into borrow pits, they're already isolated, because that's the definition of the borrow pit stocking, right? Is that it has to be isolated from all the rest of the. So I just don't wonder why stocking with those fish wouldn't be an option for us.
Yeah, no, fair question. So when a fish comes down with or gets sick with a fish disease, fish transport within Canada is still governed by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Yeah.
And so you get something called an ITC. It's basically a paperwork that says you can introduce fish to the region. The condition on that is when you shift water bodies, they can't be diseased. They have to be certified disease-free. And so that's the run-in that we get with having a hatchery on the island. That's a whole different watershed than the Peace.
Yeah.
And so it's another reason why when we do private trout pond stocking, the fish have to come from Alberta because there's no provincial trout hatchery in the Peace region. And so it's slightly backwards to send people from BC to Alberta to get rainbow trout. But from the federal lens, that's what works. And so that's where we run into issues with the ITC. Yeah.
So, yeah, okay. The ITC rules don't have anything to do with reality, essentially. It's just a rule that says you can't take it from one water body to another.
Correct.
It's not going to impact it. It's just a rule that says you can't take it from this water body to that water body if it's diseased, even though the disease is something they'll still release them with in their own water body.
And
right?
I think,
it just seems strange to me that it's sure it's a disease, everybody who it's a disease, but they will release it into its own water body with those diseases.
Correct.
And yet putting them into a burrow pit that's completely isolated, no, there's a federal rule that says that you can't do that.
Yeah. The big lens is that watershed boundary, right? That's their big red flag of transportation.
Yeah, it sounds to me like there's something we could lobby on at the federal level, right? Because if it's limiting our ability to stock the fish for our fish habitat, yeah, we're good. All right, so I get it. It's a rule that the feds have said that they can't go from water body to water body. Okay, are there any other? So I heard you say 1, 4, and 8 are still on the stocking schedule. 6, 7, and 9 are not. They came off in 2006.
Correct.
And Beaver Lake is not an option anymore.
Yeah, so that comes down to the camera data showed I think there was double-digit anglers that have fished there. The habitat in the winter, from what I can tell and from what past bios that I've spoken with have told, is there's quite a bit of vegetation that's taking that oxygen in the winter below the ice and removing it. They trialed a propane aerator in 1989 and it went horribly. The first line in the report was this project was plagued with problems. Because there's no electricity out there, you can't tie in an electric aerator just to run a constant pump. And so the propane aerator was littered with problems mechanically and just from a setup standpoint. And so that was the main driver for non-aerating beaver. And it has shown time and time again that the 1 meter water column at the top below the ice struggles to have enough oxygen to actually keep fish alive. Fish need about 4 milligrams per liter, some strange format of numbers there, but the water column consistently had 1.75. So fish can live in there. Rainbow trout will hate it. They will be stressed and most likely die. Native fish species, including dace, brook, stickleback, actually can thrive in that environment. They're very good at it. So these little wetland areas that we have up here are littered with tiny little cyprinids, which are minnows that can live in, I've seen them live in 0.5 and propagate and be completely normal. Rainbow trout, not necessarily the same case. And so they were factoring in the potential wind turbine one that would just pump water in, but because of the heavy forest around it and the height, it wasn't necessarily feasible. To kind of add on to that, so HCTF, so another acronym for you on this Monday night, the Habitat Conservation Trust Fund is the main contributor for our aerators in the region. We only have 2. So we have Inga and Sundance directly tied into BC hydroelectricity. And I think that's currently the only ones that we are going to have at this point in time.
So the fish just won't survive without some kind of aeration. Yeah. And even then it was difficult.
Yes, correct.
And does 2 have any fish in it? Have you been in there?
No.
There's not left. They're all fished out or they all died?
They all died.
Oh, that's too bad, because I thought maybe if nobody's been in there fishing, there might be some big ones in there. Just one big glass one. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any other questions? Well, James, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hopefully you are able to do some work while you're up here, as well as come to visit us. We certainly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anytime.
That you've come and you've straightened things out. And I would think that the council and the community will be happy with your decision.
Awesome.
So thank you very much.
Good. Not a problem.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Is there any public or news media questions? Seeing none, we will adjourn. Thank you very much.